Okay, our lesson this morning is about the first murder. Kind of gruesome way to start a new year, isn't it? Our text is fourth chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 15. Now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. And the Lord said, Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. You know, under normal circumstances, most parents expect great things from their children. And in one form or another, every parent has that hope for his or her child. But I guess in the whole history of the human race, there's never been a greater measure of hope for any child than the hope Adam and Eve had for their firstborn, Cain. Now, why did they have such hope in this child? Well, God had made a promise to them. That promise was that he was going to send a deliverer that would intercede between them and the devil. Now, they think that this son is going to be the deliverer. Now, later, after the couple left the Garden of Eden, Eve became pregnant. This was an event beyond description. Neither the man or the woman had ever seen pregnancy or birth before. Now, that must have been something. Don't you think God had to have a little class and set Adam and Eve down and explain the facts of life to them? It had to have happened. How would they have even known what was wrong with Eve? How would she have known the changes that were taking place in her body if somebody hadn't explained to her what was going on? Surely the Lord did this. But then again, we're just speculating, aren't we? So the wonder of birth was increased many times in the experience, because not only was this to be new life, it was to be the promised life. It was to be the one who would destroy the work of Satan and restore people to paradise once more. Can't you just imagine that Adam and Eve just counted the months and the days and the weeks until that time came? And then at last the child was born, and Eve held in her arms the one whom both she and Adam truly thought was the deliverer. But in reality, the baby that Eve held in her arms was a little murderer, and that the tragic history of the human race, written in blood, had begun. Now, we don't know how much time elapsed before Eve had her second son. Surely Adam taught his sons why they worked. Because you see, it was a part of God's creation mandate, and they were co-laborers with God. So work is not a punishment because of sin. For Adam had work to do long before he and Eve yielded to the devil in the Garden of Eden. Now let's get back to our story about Abel and Cain. As the story goes, both of these boys are now fully grown men. We don't know their age. They both came to present their offerings to the Lord. Now, these words leave out a lot we really would like to know and don't know. Because they suggest that God must have given considerable instruction to Adam and Eve about the kind of sacrifice he expected and the form of the sacrifice that he was looking for. Now, our words read literally at the end of days, meaning perhaps that God had appointed a particular time when sacrifices were to be offered. But at any rate, Abel and Cain brought their offerings, and they offered them to God. Now, Cain brought the first fruit of the soil as his offering. Abel brought an offering of the firstborn of the flock. God received Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain's offering. Now, there are many things about Genesis that trouble modern people. The acceptance of Abel's offering and the rejection of Cain's offering is high on the list because it just seems unfair and irrational that God would turn down an offering from Cain. I mean, many argue that Cain did the best he could. I mean, he brought the best that he had. Why should his offering be judged inferior to Abel's? In fact, if a choice had to be made, why shouldn't Cain's beautiful offering of fruit be accepted over Abel's bloody sacrifice? But that's just the point. Abel's sacrifice involved blood and therefore testified to the death of a substitute. You see, Abel was coming to God as God had shown that he must be approached and could only be approached. Now, when God killed the animals in the Garden of Eden and clothed Adam and Eve with their skin, he was showing that because sin brings death, innocent victims must die in order that sinners must be pardoned. The sacrifices pointed forward to Christ. And so when Abel came with the offering of blood, he was believing that God was looking forward to the provision of the true deliverer. When Cain brought his fruit, he was rejecting that provision. But again, wasn't the offering of Cain more beautiful? Well, yes, it was. And isn't God the author of all beauty? Again, yes, He is. God made the fruit Cain offered. But you see, Cain's problem is he left out the blood. Now, the offering of Cain represents all of the beautiful things of this world that God has given to us and that most of us would like to give back to Him. It is possible for us to offer these to God, but only if we first come to Him on the basis of the sacrifice of Christ. Now, if Cain had first presented the animal sacrifice, thereby confessing that he was a sinner and that sin requires death, that he was thankful to God for having shown that a substitute could die in his place, and that he was coming on that basis. And if he had done that, and then also presented his offering of fruit, God would have gladly accepted that offering. In other words, Cain should have come to the Lord and said, God, I love you so much, I just want to give you an extra offering. And that's when he would have offered the fruit. But when Cain refused to come with the blood offering, God was obliged to reject him and anything he might offer. Now that's a big trouble with so many good religious people. They come to God with their heightened sense of aesthetics and want to be received by God because of their beautiful offering. But God rejects them and their godless worship. There is no blood, no Christ, and hence no true Christianity, no matter how beautiful their offering or service might be. But on the other hand, if one comes through faith in Christ and His shed blood, then he can present all of the beautiful things he wants to bring to God, and God will accept them. God will be pleased with this, because the person who's coming to Him now doesn't trust these things to save them from their sins, but rather is offering them to God because He loves him and wants to show affection. So you see, it is only on the basis of the sacrifice of Christ that one can come. Now, there's a point here in this story that should touch us very deeply. Although the offering of Cain was rejected, God did not simply just walk away from Cain. He approached him. He tried to reason with him. And he told him what he needed to do to be accepted. And God will do the same thing for everyone who is fighting with him. Now look at God's reasoning for Cain. Cain, why is it that you're so angry? Why is your face downcast? Cain, don't you know that if you do what is right, you will be accepted? But Cain, if you don't do what is right, sin is waiting at the door to get a hold of you. It desires to have you, and you must master it. Now, there are several parts of this reasoning here. First, there's an indication that God saw Cain in whatever state he was in. Cain was downcast. He had turned away. He may even withdraw from society. He may turn his back on his parents. But God sees all this regardless, just as He sees you and me. And second, Cain should not have been angry. The fault was not outside itself, as it were, something that could not be changed. It could be changed, and the only one who could change it was Cain himself. And so too it is with us. Don't we have a tendency sometimes to blame others when our troubles come? Now, while others are sometimes a factor, the true cause is seldom there. It is within us. Remember that comic strip character Pogo? What did he have to say? We have met the enemy, and it is us. That was Cain's problem. His greatest enemy was himself. And third, there's a reminder of the right course of action. God says, Cain, if you'll just do what's right, everything is going to be okay. If you'll just do what is right, your offering will be accepted. And this is another indication that the way to approach God by sacrifice was made clear to Adam and Eve a long time before this. And if God hadn't done that, if he had not told Adam and Eve the kind of sacrifice he wanted, how could he reject Cain's offering? How would Cain even know? So God had to have sat down with Adam and Eve and possibly all of his descendants, how many ever there were, and told him, this is the kind of sacrifice that I require. And if he hadn't told them that, there's no way he could have rejected Cain's offering for bringing something other than what he wanted. And so God rejected Cain's offering, and he rejected what Cain did, not because of his lack of knowledge, but because of his lack of humility and faith and obedience. He refused to come with the sacrifice because he considered that confession of his need demeaning. And finally, God gave a warning, and the warning was that in refusing to come on God's terms, Cain was flirting with disaster. Now, the cause of his anger was sin, and sin was about to master him. That's the case with a lot of us, isn't it? Sin is always crouching at our door. It desires to master us, and in many cases it has. But we must master it. But how can we do that? We can't do it in and of ourselves. We are inadequate for these kind of things. If we're going to master sin, we must first be mastered by him who has already mastered sin. In other words, we must be the masters. Now, Cain did not allow himself to be mastered by God, and so he became enslaved by the devil. Sin had its way with him, and he became the first murderer. And what a murderer he became. Now, if we were to speak in the terminology of today, we would not be able to claim that Cain was guilty of something like negligent homicide. We couldn't even say that he was guilty of second-degree murder or any other category that would lessen the offense. This was absolute, premeditated, first-degree murder. Cain plotted Abel's death, and then he pulled it off. He invited his brother to go out into the field, and when he was outside the view of his mother and his father, he killed his brother. He attacked him and killed him. But you know the problem with that? Cain was not out of sight of God. God sees everything, and he saw Cain. And so God said to him, Cain, where is your brother? Now look at Cain's reply. I don't know. Not my week to keep up with him. Now think for just a moment how evil this reply is. It contains the first lie in the Bible and also the first question. The lie was Cain's denial that he knew his brother's whereabouts. He knew exactly where he was, probably knew where he had buried him. But so greatly had sin mastered him at this point that he not only lied, he lied to God, no doubt thinking he could get away with it. That's how far sin has moved in just one generation. from one generation to the next, sin has entered the world in the form of murder. Now, it is true that Adam and Eve tried to shift the blame when God had confronted them with their sin, but they did not lie. They told the truth, even though they were trying to escape from under the truth. But now Cain lies, and his lie is to God. And then second, Cain asked a question. Again, it's the first human question in the Bible. And this is even worse than the lie. So hard is his heart that he now suggests that the brother whom he has killed is not his responsibility. If something has happened, well, it must be Abel's fault. It's his own fault, Lord. I can't keep up with him. You see, in this dog-eat-dog world, it's every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. Can't we hear the voice of modern man in Cain's cruel question? Surely we do. We are living in a generation today that just doesn't want to get involved. And too often we turn deaf ears to the cries of those in need. Now there's one final thought here from the New Testament book of Jude, where the Bible speaks only of Cain. And it references here, Jude says, do not go the way of Cain. What is the way of Cain? Think a moment. What would you think the way of Cain would be? Pardon? Okay. Okay. The way of Cain is the rejection of what God has offered for our salvation. That's the way of Cain. And Jude, in this New Testament book, tells us to avoid the way of Cain at all costs. If we're walking in Cain's way, we have rejected God's way of salvation provided for us through the shed blood of Christ, and we refuse to accept the responsibility for our own state or the state of others. We refuse to heed the warning of God and turn back while there is still time. Could God have forgiven Cain of this heinous act? Sure, he could have. God gave him that opportunity, but he refused it. The call here is not to take the way of Cain, but to take the way of Abel, who, although he was killed by his brother, nevertheless had the testimony of God that he was a righteous man. If you look in the book of Hebrews, God says of Abel, by faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith he still speaks, even though he is dead. The thought here is we must let Abel speak to us and not Cain. Now, the more we think about Cain's sin, the more heinous it becomes. This murder was not motivated by passion. It was carefully premeditated. Cain didn't kill a stranger in defense. He murdered his own brother out of envy and out of hatred. Furthermore, Cain did it after being at the altar to worship. He had been to the altar to worship God, but his offering was rejected, and so he killed his brother. Now, as we look at the remainder of our lesson this morning, it deals with the curse God places on Cain for his sin. Now, vagabond has no home. A fugitive is one who is running from home. A stranger is away from home, and a pilgrim is heading home. Of these four, Cain made the wrong choice. And instead of being a pilgrim in life, he became a stranger and a fugitive, just wandering the land. As far as we know, there was never a change in Cain's heart. Not only did he become the first murderer, he might have become the first human being to go to hell. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, and that's me speculating. I'm just reading between the lines. Cain became a wanderer, and as the old saying goes, he had nowhere to hang his hat. Now, the judgment of God on Cain for the murder of Abel is a very serious thing. Earlier, we have seen God's judgment on Satan, Eve, and Adam. Satan is cursed, the ground is cursed, but Adam and Eve are not cursed. Now, for the first time, the curse of God is laid on a mortal. God's word to Cain is, "Now you are under a curse, and you are driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood." Now, this curse was a fearful thing, yet in certain ways it was less than Cain deserved. God was being gracious to Cain. The curse that he placed upon him, first of all, was a curse that affected the ground so far as Cain's ever tilling the ground was concerned. This is explained as meaning, Cain, when you work the ground, it is no longer going to yield its crops for you. Now, the fact that he became a restless wanderer on earth is a consequence of the curse. What Cain really deserved was death. A few chapters further on, when we get into the story of Noah, which is next week, by the way, God institutes capital punishment, saying to Noah, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed." If death is the divinely appointed punishment for murder, and man is given authority to pronounce this punishment, God certainly had the right to punish Cain in this way. Yet he did not do that, and that's how great his mercy is. We see then that God punished Cain with far less punishment than he deserved. But in Cain's eyes, his punishment was far more than he could bear. Look at verses 13 and 14 again. "And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." You know what that is? That's the complaint of an unrepentant heart. How horrible sin is. Cain refused to come to God by the way of sacrifice, which God had graciously provided. And rejected, he plunged into an ever-increasing vortex of hatred and murder. After being judged by God in a manner far less than he deserved, he complained because the earth was not going to be kind to him, and he would become a wanderer. Don't we see this today in so many lives? How many times have we heard, or maybe even said ourselves, "That's not fair"? How many times have we complained against God, knowing that if he was just and fair, he would have already sentenced us to hell for the sins that we have committed? Now, since the Bible is silent on what actually took place, let's do a little assuming here. Let's assume that for the sake of argument, that God had established a place of meeting and worship for Adam and his descendants. Somewhere over in the corner of the Garden of Eden, he had probably set up an altar. And he told them, "This is the place that I want you to come to worship me, to bring your sacrifices. Now, when Cain speaks of the presence of the Lord in this passage, it could well be this is the place he's thinking of. You know what Cain should have done when God came to him and says, Cain, what have you done? He should have gone running to God and fallen on his knees and begged for forgiveness. He should have been like Jacob at the brook Jabbok. What did Jacob do? He grabbed God and wrapped his arms around him and refused to let him go until God blessed him. That's what Cain should have done. And had he done that, God would have blessed him and he would have forgiven him. But Cain, driven from God's presence, would become a restless wanderer on the earth. Now, while Cain's physical life would be preserved, he would have to leave his family, he would lose all sense of community, and he would just wander from place to place. And even worse, Cain feared that he would be a hunted fugitive. And his fear was that everyone who met him would be after him to kill him. Now again, as far as we know, Cain never repented of his sin. His word of remorse here is not for his sin, but for his punishment. He's more concerned with his punishment than he is his character. And if he wandered from place to place, he would be in danger. But if he stayed in one place, he would starve. The earth had turned against him, God had turned against him, and people had probably turned against him. Anybody Cain met would be a relative who might want to avenge Abel's murder. So what could he do? By hating and murdering his brother and refusing to repent, Cain created for himself an intolerable life. He opened the door to temptation, and then he closed the door to his family, to God and his future. No matter where he lived or what he did, Cain would always be a restless man with a restless soul for whom there was no remedy. But now notice something. The God of mercy did a strange thing. He put a mark on Cain that would protect him. I wonder what that mark was. Wish the Bible had told us that. You know, I've heard down through the years many things of what the mark of Cain was. One was that that's how the Negro race got started. That's probably not true at all. But it would be interesting to know what was that mark. But it was something that when people saw that mark, they knew to avoid this guy Cain at all costs. Leave him alone. Don't bother him. Don't touch him. And if you do touch him, your punishment is going to be 7 times worse than Cain's punishment. God, out of his mercy for this murderer, gave him a way out of death for a while. But that mark was a sign that said, this man has already been judged by God. Leave him alone. God's verbal curse on Cain was likely transmitted among all of Adam's family as a warning that Cain was not to be killed. This was purely an act of mercy on God's part. Now, the way of Cain is hard. It should be avoided at all costs. Listen to how one commentator put it. He says, Cain started with human reason as opposed to divine revelation. He continued in human willfulness instead of divine will. He opposed human pride to divine humility. He sank to human hatred instead of rising to divine love. He presented human excuses instead of seeking divine grace. He went into wandering instead of seeking to return. And he ended in human loneliness instead of divine fellowship. That describes Cain to a T. To be alone without God is the worst thing that earth can hold. But to go into eternity that way, that's entering into the second death. Now, in just 4 chapters of this first book of God's revelation to mankind, God has shown us sin and all of its ugliness. But here's the good part. This same God devotes the rest of Scripture to show us that not only is He a God of mercy, but He shows us a way out of walking the way of Cain. He has taken the necessary steps to free us from that kind of lifestyle. You see, the choice is ours, and it's a choice that we have to make. Cain had a choice, and he made it, and he had to suffer the consequences of that choice. And that will be the same thing for every person who has ever lived. We all one day will answer for the choices we make in life. And that concludes our lesson. Any questions?